Okay, now in order to kind of talk about this, I actually want us to look back together at Genesis, chapters 1 through 11, okay? And I want you to see that there are two major movements in Genesis 1 through 11 that we see actually reiterated for us, okay? And the first of these movements is the hospitality of creation, okay? So you'll remember that we saw this back in Genesis chapter 1, and then actually when Genesis chapter 1 is sort of reiterated for us in Genesis chapter 8 after Noah and the flood, that same thing happens, okay? The hospitality of creation. Okay, so if you think back with me to the beginning of Genesis chapter 1, the beginning of this series we were in, maybe you'll remember how Genesis 1 is showing us the hospitality of God. Maybe you don't remember this, but let me explain it to you. God is in some ways, just at the beginning there, this great host who's setting things out for his creation and making sure that they have a home and a dwelling and a place. And I think you can see this through a number of ways, but okay, here's the big picture, right? The days of creation in Genesis 1, days 1, 2, and 3 are then filled, you might remember, in days 4, 5, and 6. They correspond. So what's created in day 4 fills day 1, right? Created in day 5 fills day 2. Created in day 6 fills day 3. This is why I think it seems so strange to us that God in day 1 can create light and darkness, and yet there isn't, for another few days, a sun and a moon and stars. You know, we kind of go like, what is this? I mean, this is so unscientific. What gives? Don't you know that you have to have sort of something that gives light in order to have a day and a night and all that kind of stuff? Well, I mean, part of the whole point is actually God's filling his hospitality. He's creating something and then saying, you belong here. You belong here. It's strange until we realize that what we're being shown is not just that there is only one creator God, which is a big part of what's happening there, but that this creator God is the God who is the great host, and his hospitality is his care for his world, giving them a home, giving us a home, where we can be nourished and where we can flourish. So the story goes on, right? Humankind, of course, is made in the very image of God, and is placed with intention and with great care in the garden, there on the 6th day. He's placed mankind, Adam and Eve there are placed in the middle of the fruit trees and the seeds that bear plants according to their kind. And they're placed and they're tended by God himself. And God puts them there in the garden so that they might be nourished with all this food to eat that God reiterates again and again, but also they might flourish. They might tend it and multiply and fill and be creators like him, hospitable creators. And what we are also to notice is that God is there with them. He walks with them in the cool of the day. In some ways, he's made his home right there with them. They are made for that place. They're made for one another, to live and to walk and to be in communion and fellowship with God and with one another. Here's what we're told. The very beginning, that is what you are made for. And living outside of that existence harms actually your nourishing and your flourishing. That's what you were made for. To be home in creation, to be home with other people, to be home with God. This is the great movement, the first great movement of the story of the Scriptures. The hospitable Creator God, being home with him. I mentioned that this great movement in Genesis 1 is reiterated for us again in Genesis chapter 8, and then also in chapter 9 a little bit. After the rebellion of sin with Adam and Eve that grows into the murder of one of their sons, Abel, by another one of their sons, Cain, and then that same sin grows, right, into Lamech saying, I'm going to give revenge on those who hurt me 77 times. And then that grows into, God's sons taking the daughters of men. It says, whomever they chose, they take them. And then we read actually at the beginning of chapter 6, the wickedness of man was great on the earth, and that every intention of the thoughts of his heart was only evil continually. It's after this growth of sin and this growth of violence that God sends the flood. And in the aftermath of the flood is we have reiterated for us the days of creation. And actually at the end of that, well, you'll remember actually at the beginning of that reiteration, the wind, the ruah, which is the same word for spirit in the beginning of Genesis chapter 1, is over the waters, brooding. You have this recreation take place. And then you have Noah again planting a garden, which is to say you're supposed to think, he's home. God, the great hospitable one, has made a place for us again. Anyway, what I'm suggesting to you is that this is this first movement that we have for us in Genesis, and it's reiterated for us. We're not supposed to sort of pass it by. We're supposed to see that God is saying, I have made a home for you, where you will be nourished and where you will flourish, where you will dwell with me, you will dwell properly in this world, and you will dwell in perfect fellowship with one another. And that is what you were made for. And all of our hearts actually have this deep longing for that. The hospitality of God, a place where we actually sit and we go, I belong perfectly here. That's an important first movement. In fact, I think you really won't get the whole rest of the story unless you get that first movement. But there's a second movement that is incredibly important in those first chapters too, and I want us to speak to that next. And that it's going to sound a little bit different way of saying it maybe, but the second movement is a movement east. Okay, it's actually a directional movement. I could have just said the second movement is sin, and that would have been right.